Exodus chapter 3, verses 1 through 10 says this. One day Moses was tending the flock of his father-in-law, Jethro, the priest of Midian. He led the flock far into the wilderness and came to Sinai, the mountain of God. There the angel of the Lord appeared to him in a blazing fire from the middle of a bush. Moses stared in amazement. Though the bush was engulfed in flames, it did not burn up. This is amazing, Moses said to himself. Why isn't that bush burning up? I must go see it. When the Lord saw Moses coming to take a closer look, God called to him from the middle of the bush, Moses, Moses. Here I am, Moses replied. Do not come any closer, the Lord warned. Take off your sandals, for you're standing on holy ground. I am the God of your father, the God of Abraham, the God of Isaac, the God of Jacob. When Moses heard this, he covered his face because he was afraid to look at God. Then the Lord told him, I have certainly seen the oppression of my people in Egypt. I have heard their cries of distress because of their harsh slave drivers. Yes, I am aware of their suffering. So I have come down to rescue them from the power of the Egyptians and lead them out of Egypt into their own fertile and spacious land. It is land flowing with milk and honey, the land where the Canaanites, Hittites, Amorites, Perizzites, Hivites, and Jebusites now live. Look, the cry of the people of Israel has reached me. I have seen how harshly the Egyptians abuse them. Now go, for I am sending you to Pharaoh. You must lead my people Israel out of Egypt. In this chapter 3 of Exodus, there are several firsts that we encounter in all of Scripture. This is the first time we hear the word holy. This is the first time we hear the reference of holy, where God says, the ground that you're standing on is holy ground. Second thing that we see is the second first that we see in this passage is God referring to his people. God referring to the Israelites as my people. We see that in verse 10. Previous verses in Genesis all the way up to this point, we don't hear God referring to the Israelites as my people. But this is the first reference. You will lead my people out of Egypt. Moses is about to have this encounter with God. It's a life-changing encounter. This day started out like just any other day, but it quickly turns into a day that Moses will probably never forget in his life. Moses had a God moment, a moment that would alter the course of his life and put him in a position that he didn't want, he didn't ask for, and wasn't eager to accept. A God moment leaves a lasting impression in our lives. We are touched, challenged, convicted, perhaps healed. It changes or alters our life. Moses' God moment catapults him into the middle of the crisis in Egypt. We know that he was born in Egypt. We know that when he was born, there was an order from the king, the Pharaoh, to kill all the newborn boys, Hebrew newborn boys. But his mother hid him. She kept him hidden for 3 months. And then we didn't look at the story in chapter 2, but basically what happens is after she no longer could hold him or keep him secret, she makes a basket, puts him in there, and kind of throws him into the Nile River. Pharaoh's daughter happened to be nearby, heard the crying, went and looked at the baby, saw the baby, picked him up. Moses' sister Miriam was keeping an eye out, and when she saw what happened, she went to Pharaoh's daughter and said, hey, should I get one of the Hebrew women to nurse the baby for you? And Pharaoh's daughter's like, that sounds like a great idea. So Miriam goes and gets her mother, Moses' mom, and she has him until a certain age when he is taken back to Pharaoh's daughter, who raises him in her own household. he leaves Egypt, and now many years later, this God moment is going to put him right back into the middle of the crisis in Egypt. This is the continuation of God's plan, his purpose for the descendants of Abraham to become a great nation. Hey, Moses had this encounter with God. I don't know, maybe some of you have had an encounter with God. A moment when you know that it was God that was speaking to you. Whether it's through an audible voice, whether it's something that you felt strongly in your heart, this has to be a God moment. I want to talk about a few things, the results of an encounter with God. Encountering God will change your life. Moses left his life in Egypt and he settled in a city called Midian, or area called Midian. Moses now is a shepherd. Life of a shepherd is, how exciting could it be? You feed the sheep, make sure you take them out to pasture, and you protect the sheep. That's it. There's nothing else. He didn't have a cell phone back then, so he can be on his phone looking at things while the sheep are just grazing or eating. He didn't have books for him to read. How did shepherds pass their time? I have no idea. I figure David probably practiced his sling, right? Hitting things. Target practice. He had a lot of time to think. But life of a shepherd was very just mundane. Every day is the same thing. Your scenery might change, but the task remains the same. Feed and protect. We're told in chapter 3 that Moses is out deep in the wilderness, and he actually arrives to Mount Sinai. Moses sees something unusual. He sees smoke, or he sees a fire. And the longer he looks, he notices something very unusual. It's on fire, but it's not burning up. What does that mean? When we burn a piece of log, you see the flames. Eventually, the log begins to shrink because it's burning up. This is not what was happening here. It was on fire, but the shape remained the same. So he's intrigued by that, so he wants to go check it out. As he's walking closer, he hears, "Moses, Moses." And he answers, here I am. And God says this, "Take off your sandals, for you're standing on holy ground." It has been declared holy. It wasn't just an ordinary ground. There was nothing about the ground around that bush that was different than any other area of the mountain. But yet, it was declared holy because God's presence was there. Moses is gripped with fear. I mean, I would be afraid if I heard a bush talking to me. But he is afraid because he says, take off your sandals, for the ground you're standing is holy ground. He covered his face, and he did not want to look because he was afraid. In Exodus chapter 33, verse 20, we're told this, "But you may not look directly at my face, for no one may see me and live." You see, it was common knowledge back in the time that you cannot see God. If you see God, you will die. Not because God is some vengeful God, but because of his holiness. Because he is so holy that we cannot look at him and survive. So when Moses is having this conversation, and when he realizes that it's God, he hides his face. He is in the presence of God. The very ground that he is standing on has been declared holy. Moses is lying prostrate on the ground with his eyes covered. The picture I see is he's just on the ground, hands over his eyes, making sure I just don't want to look because I don't want to die. This is an incredible encounter with God. This is an example of what they call a theophany. A theophany is a manifestation or an appearance of God in a form that is visible to human senses. A theophany. This is an example. So Moses has this incredible encounter, and he is speaking with God. And this is very unusual because you and I, my guess is that we have never encountered God in this way. And throughout the whole scripture, there's only a few times when we see something to this effect. Paul, on his way to Damascus, he has an encounter with God. A bright light, it blinds him. Moses and Paul, there are a few other people perhaps. This is a very unusual encounter. God reveals to Moses many different things here in their conversation. One of the things that he reveals to him is about what he is about to do. And during the conversation, God reveals to Moses his personal name. In a verse that we didn't look at, in verse 14 of chapter 3, God replied to Moses, I am who I am. Say this to the people of Israel. I am has sent me to you. I am has sent me to you. God's name is I am. Okay, that sounds a little weird, doesn't it? What does this mean? Here's a little background on this statement, or God's name. God called himself I am, a name which describes his eternal power and unchangeable character. I am that I am declares God to be self-existent, without beginning, without end. This is also expressed in the term Yahweh. We see this in the Old Testament, the term Yahweh. In the Hebrew, it's actually written YHWH, Yahweh. This name means I am the one who is. I am the one who is. And it's usually the name or the reference that is most commonly found in reference to God, Yahweh. It is the most significant name for God in the Old Testament. By identifying himself as I am, God is declaring that he always exists in the immediate. He isn't bound by time like we are. There was never a time when God wasn't. He has no fixed point when he was born or brought into being. He has no beginning or end. He is the Alpha and Omega, the first and the last. I am. It means I existed always. And when God and Moses are talking, Moses, when he hears what God wants him to do, he says, okay, suppose I go to Egypt and I tell the Israelites, hey, I'm here to take you guys out. Suppose they say, who has sent you? Who am I to tell them? Who should I say sent me? That is when God says, tell them that I am has sent you. Just that conversation, just that statement tells me when the Israelites should be familiar with this name. They should be familiar with this name. But the interesting thing is that by the time, when you look at the age, by the time Moses leaves Egypt, he's 40 years old. And by the time God speaks to him here, another 40 years has passed. People have been enslaved in Israel, or in Egypt, for many generations already. Maybe up to 80 years. How would that generation, how would the younger generation, how would they know who I am is? Most likely, they still were told about the stories of all of that had happened from their parents. But we have to assume that the Israelites would know who I am is when Moses spoke to them. Moses has this incredible encounter with God, and it will change the course of his life forever. Encountering with God will change our lives. Second thing about encounter this morning I wanted to highlight is that God initiates encounters. God initiates an encounter to commission us to participate in his purposes. Okay? God initiates an encounter to commission us to participate in his purposes. That is what we see here. God initiates this encounter with Moses. Why? Because he wants to commission Moses. He wants to send Moses to do his work, to serve and partner with him to accomplish his purpose. The change for Moses is immediate. It's like God says, get up and go now. Leave everything behind and go for the task that I have called you to do. Many times in our life, we feel that God doesn't care about our sufferings. We cry out to God and we pray for relief, for intervention. All we get is silence. I'm sure the Israelites felt the same way. They have been suffering for many years, perhaps up to 80 years that they've been suffering because of hard physical labor and the brutality of the slave masters. Life was difficult. And as far as they were concerned, this God that they had heard about has abandoned them, has forgotten them. A new generation was born during the time of slavery. They did not experience the things that a previous generations have experienced. They knew very little about God, I think. They didn't know about his power. They didn't know about the miracles. Israel also was without, the Israelites were also without a leader at this time. Moses was gone, they were enslaved. No leader. There's no one to intercede on their behalf. They were miserable like sheep without a shepherd. They're lost like a sheep without a shepherd. And you enter Moses now, who as a sheep, or who as a shepherd, will lead the sheep out of Egypt into greener pastures. The analogy that's going on here is very similar. Moses being a shepherd. After he leaves, he becomes a shepherd, and now he's going to be called to go back. In the New Testament, what do we see? Jesus says, I am the good shepherd. There's a lot of analogies going on here, similarities between the New Testament and Old Testament. And we looked a couple of weeks ago how Satan is behind the scenes trying to wipe off the descendant, the seed that will ultimately defeat him. We see the same thing happening in the New Testament with Herod. Look at verse 7. Then the Lord said to Moses, I have certainly seen the oppression of my people in Egypt. I have heard their cries of distress because of their harsh slave drivers. Yes, I am aware of their suffering. If you have felt like your cries to God for intervention, your cries to God for justice have gone ignored, have gone unheard, chapter 3 should be a source of encouragement to you. Because we see in chapter 3, verse 7, I have certainly seen the oppression of my people in Egypt. I have heard their cries of distress. Yes, I am aware of their sufferings. This is God talking to Moses. All those years as they were suffering and crying out to me, I know each and every single one. I have heard each and every single one of their cries. I have heard. I have not ignored. I have heard every single one. And I am aware. These are very comforting words. God knows, He hears, He listens, He notices. Silence does not mean that God doesn't care. Silence doesn't mean that God doesn't hear us. Silence does not mean that He doesn't care. Yet that's how we interpret silence far too often. God is preparing to move. He's preparing to act. And what we see in chapter 3, verse 7 is this heart that God has towards His children. That God is not a distant God, but He is near, that He is actively involved in the lives of His children. He may not be responding and acting right away, but He is listening and He is aware. That God is dialed into what is happening in each one of our lives. Can you just take a moment for this? Some individual, some person in a small little city, far away from what's going on, he is crying out to God and saying, God, today has been a tough day. My slave master, man, he drove me to the ground. I don't know how much longer I can take this. If you're out there, you have to do something. A person who, in that moment, just says, I have nothing else left. I don't even know if I can get up tomorrow to do this again. That God is aware of that one person who cries out in that manner. Our lives are filled with a lot of trials. Things happen in our lives. Last couple of years, I think I've been reminded at any moment, a phone can ring, a text message can come in that could just alter our lives. We got a text message yesterday or the day before. Father-in-law texted us, hey, we're in the ER. Anytime those two words, ER, it's like the worst words, right? ER. And so we begin to worry or concern. Whenever they say they found some irregularities or abnormalities, those words are just gut-wrenching, especially when your distance is such a factor. And so we're like waiting, what's the news, what's going on? It's this constant reminder that any moment our lives can be altered. Something can happen, catastrophic event could occur. You watch the news and something happens all the time. I had a friend visiting last week, and he lives in Southern California, and when he was up here, he was like, the nature, right? Think about Oregon, the Northwest, you love the nature. He's like, this is so nice, I just need to be in nature. So him and his family, they went hiking, they went all, the typical stuff, the falls and things like that. And I was telling him, people hike all the time. You're out in the wilderness, and sometimes you see a lone. I used to take students, youth students backpacking. We used to do 2 or 3 night trips up to Eagle Creek, up in the gorge. And sometimes you're out hiking. We never go alone. We always have at least 4 or 5 people. As we're going, sometimes you see one person walking the other direction, and you're just kind of like, okay. The guy's been probably, that's part of the Pacific Coast Trail, so people like to go from Mexico to Canada. It's very popular. And they have these points along the trail where you can ship supplies. It's like a post office up on the trails. You can ship supplies. So people that are planning to do the whole thing would say, okay, calculate how much food I need to use, how much should I ship, and maybe some people actually will ship clothing and shoes as well, because you're walking thousands and thousands of miles. So you just see this weird guy. But I was telling him, sometimes you hear stories about a person that goes missing. And just a couple of weeks ago, there were at least 2 or 3 cases. Within a week or two, people that went missing, and their bodies were discovered sometime later. So whether it's news from family, whether it's news just in general, our lives can change at any minute. We could be suffering. We can be going through some traumatic experience, and we could suffer. A boss at work, a co-worker, family situations. God is aware of our hardships. He's aware of our sufferings. And you can cry out to him, but if he does not answer, if he is silent, does not mean that he doesn't care. God is aware of the Israelites suffering as slaves. He has heard each and every one of their cries for help, for deliverance, for justice. It has not gone unnoticed. Look at verse 8. So I have come down to rescue them from the power of the Egyptians and to lead them out of Egypt into their own fertile and spacious land. God is speaking with Moses about the situation with the Israelites in Egypt, and he reveals a plan, his plan to rescue them. We know that the reason that they are in Egypt, the miraculous way that they arrived, the plan of God was to raise them into a mighty nation. The promise that he made to Abraham, Isaac, Jacob, is the same promise that he makes here to Moses. I will take them out of Egypt. Yes, things are not going well at the moment for them. Yes, they are suffering. They are enslaved, they are dejected, and without hope. But God has a plan. And God tells Moses, I'm ready to act now. I'm ready to rescue them. Because Moses, you were born for this purpose. You were saved for this purpose. You escaped out of Egypt for this purpose, to go back. Verse 10, now go, for I am sending you to Pharaoh. You must lead my people, Israel, out of Egypt. You know, the thing about this call, the thing about this encounter is that Moses is content with his life in Midian. He's happy. As far as he's concerned, the memory of Egypt is far in his past. He doesn't even want to think about Egypt. He's married, he's got kids, and life is good. Not exciting, but still, it's good. It's been 40 years since he left Egypt. He doesn't want to remember those days anymore. If you know the story of what happens, he actually kills a Pharaoh, or he kills an Egyptian who was just beating on a Hebrew slave. And that fear of being discovered leads him to flee Egypt. So in some way, he's a convict. He's like, God, you're asking me to go back to Egypt? No. I'm not going back to Egypt. Forget it. You know, God's call upon Moses is absolutely clear. No denying what God wanted Moses to do. God chose to appear to Moses, to have this encounter with him, an unusual encounter through a burning bush. God initiated this encounter because he was commissioning, he wanted to commission Moses to partner with him to fulfill his purpose. Exodus 4:13. So after many conversations, this is what Moses says. Moses again pleaded, Lord, please send anyone else. Send anyone else but me. Yeah, I heard you. I understand all the things you want. But God, please send someone else. It's very interesting. Moses didn't want to go. When God calls, we have a choice to go or not to go. To say yes or no. The calling may be for a task that is difficult for you to perform. It might be something that you are not comfortable doing. But make no mistake, when God calls, he calls you for the task because he believes that you can do it. I don't think he ever asks us to do something that we cannot do. Is there something that God is calling you to do? Is there something that you know you should do, but you have been putting it off? Maybe you're like Moses, and you say, God, no, anyone but me, please. Let me encourage you this morning to put your trust in God, who has put his trust in you, by calling you to join him in accomplishing his purpose in this world. That is the God that we trust. Not on our own abilities, but trusting that God will use us to accomplish his purpose. And this is what Moses has to digest. This is what Moses is processing. Do I say yes or no? It's to this point, up to this point in chapter 3, his answer is no. And we'll see how that changes.